Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. Welcome. You got some folks on the phone. We'll introduce ourselves. I'm Ian, one of the co-founders of FreePlay. We're going to be talking today about this idea about, the new AI software development life cycle, the workflow that we see teams using successfully in production to run AI products, and how it's different from traditional software. I think a lot of um, the experience we see people go through is, as they get AI products up and running and live, they sometimes learn the hard way that things are very different. So the goal of the time today is going to be digging into like what's different, what's changed, why it's worth thinking of a different thing. We'll do some quick intros here. And then we will leave some time at the end for a demo. The goal today is not really a free play demo. The goal is more like, how do we put some of these ideas into practice? So with that, I'm going to let Eric and Jeremy quickly say hello and introduce themselves. You'll be hearing from all of us on the call.
You can jump in. Thanks, Ian. I'm Eric Ryan, co-founder, CTO here at FreePlay. I'd say I started my career in mostly like back-end distributed systems type engineering, but I've spent the majority of my career building and leading technical teams. I think most notably, I was paired up with Ian, where I ran engineering at Twitter for Twitter's developer platform for about 7 years. That's me. Jeremy?
I'm Jeremy. I lead product at FreePlay. Most of my career has been working as a ML engineer, building language models even before the GPT era, the dark ages. In addition to leading product at FreePlay, I also spend a lot of time just like partnering with our enterprise customers and going deep with them.
And Eric kind of hit it, but background for me is on the product side, building developer products. It's really on the team that helped launch Mapbox way back in the day, worked on some government API and open data projects, got paired up with Eric at GNIP. We got acquired by Twitter, spent a decade working together, building the developer platform for all the Twitter development ecosystem. And we've been working on FreePlay now for a couple of years, started in 2022, right as some of the LM stuff was taken off. Like I said, this isn't a big sales demo, but we're making sure people have the context. FreePlay is a platform for running the kind of workflows we're about to get into. We help with observability and evals and testing and human review workflows for production teams. I want to pass to Eric to kind of set us up here and talk about the problem space, especially, as engineering and product leaders are thinking about what's different here. How do we set up our teams for success? Eric, I'll let you drive.
Great. Thank you, Ian. This is really why we're all here. Gen AI changes nearly everything about building software products. I've been running software teams for over 15 years at this point, and this honestly feels like one of the biggest shifts in my career with the way that people are approaching their work. When you first look at the space, you might not think so, but anybody who's really gotten their hands dirty building with LLMs quickly realizes that this is true. So what's actually different? There are a ton of new primitives that most software teams have never worked with. If you've been building with web apps or distributed systems for the last decade, things have definitely changed. But even if you've been on a traditional ML team, things will feel a little bit different too. You weren't prompting before, you weren't used to a world where you can't retrain the model yourself, and you probably weren't using subjective evals. The workflows and the skills are different too. And really, the whole product development lifecycle is different. Some notable things, figuring out what's possible is often experimental. Design feels maybe much more iterative in this new world. Testing is often non-deterministic. Quality is multidimensional. Observability is about real-world user behavior. How folks are actually using your product in the wild is a very important component of how we want to operate these days. And the roles are changing. So we've had pretty strict expectations of who does what on a software team, honestly, since the advent of Agile. It's been pretty static for the past 10 or so years. The reality is that someone on the team needs to start doing these new tasks on the right, and it's not always obvious who that person should be. We've heard from a lot of engineering leaders who don't want to pay really expensive ML engineers to tweak English prompts. We've also heard from a lot of those like PhD ML engineer types that it's actually not their favorite thing to do either. And, if you're building a straightforward LLM application, doing something like categorization, maybe engineers can lead that effort. Same thing with if you're building kind of a straightforward open-ended chatbot, consumer chatbot experience. But if you're doing anything specialized and nuanced, like summarizing financial documents or building a complex agent for customer service, you really want to get domain experts involved. These are the people who really know what good looks like in your organization. And oftentimes these folks have never been involved in the engineering process before. So it's kind of a whole new world.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that. That was one of the things that I had this experience at I previously had worked in health tech, and this was just huge for us. Is, we were building models, a lot of language models and stuff like that. And we on the ML team were I have no idea, right? I don't know if this is good or bad or what I'm looking at here. So it was I kind of felt like I saw that becoming more and more important for everyone. And I think we've seen that play out over the last couple of years.
Totally. Great point, Jeremy. So this can get overwhelming pretty quickly. So many people think that building is hard, actually the hard part. But honestly, getting a basic AI-powered app wired up is really the easy part. It's much harder to get things working in production consistently over time. And we've listed a number of concerns that come up here. People start to see these once they're in production, and they really get bogged down trying to answer them. Ultimately, the risk is that your team runs slow and gets distracted trying to figure out all this stuff through trial and error. Customers are unhappy, and both they and your wider organization can lose trust in what you're doing. But there's a better way. For teams that figure out that better way to work, it can really feel transformative. Here's a quote from one of our customers, Postscript, to illustrate the point. They figured out how to build evals that actually matter for their product and turn that into the ability to confidently test any change before putting it into production. And doing so got them to production faster and has given them a foundation to build and run their new agent product experience with confidence. So how did they do it? I'll turn it back over to Ian to walk us through that.
All right. Thanks, Eric. So I'm going to run through how we think about, maybe if there's an old world software development lifecycle, it's kind of linear. You go through the design, build, test, ship it, monitor it, workflow. What's different in this world? Because I think a lot of the success that teams Eric just mentioned Postscript, but lots of the folks we work with that have found, it's been not just in tooling, it's been in figuring out how do they actually run this iteration cycle and set up their team to do it on an ongoing basis. So in our world, what does this better look like? You can start to get a sense if the free play logo, where it comes from. There are these loops, and they're not different from traditional software where you're ideally doing some version of build, test, learn, and iterate. But there is this big difference of evals at the center. We're going to talk about how evals play a role at each of these stages, and ideally how your system gets better the more that your evals support each of these stages. But maybe we're going to talk also about what is different about these versus traditional software processes. So, big picture, what are we after? We're after a world where, especially if you've been building this space, you might know it's hard to get there. Can you monitor production and know if there are any issues or errors happening? A lot of times that's not true. And we've, heard a lot of folks who say, hey, our QA process, when we first turn something on in production with generative AI, is basically customer support tickets. Once you're finding stuff, you want to have some confidence to know how to fix it, to actually be able to make changes and improve quality. You need to be able to test those. This is kind of the holy grail. How do we get to a world where you can run a bunch of tests and trust what's happening before we ship it? And ultimately just move faster, right? If the goal of any product effort is ship a better product to your customers, move the metrics in the right direction, that's where we want to end up. So, talk about this build stage. With each of these stages, we're just going to talk quickly about what's happening, in this stage that maybe is important to think about. And we'll share just a couple tips, in each one, the kind of top of mind, highest alpha lessons learned from looking at how these processes work across hundreds of teams in the past 3 years. So big picture, the build stage, what are you after? Ultimately the ability to create and iterate on your product with confidence. I think most teams start with an assumption. It's what are we talking about here? We're talking about our basic prompt and agent behavior. But then there's also at this stage, probably not enough teams early on thinking about the building blocks of the system also being evals and data sets that you'd use to run those evals offline to test your system. And early on, as much as possible, setting up production pipelines so that you can monitor them and run evals in production at some point, and then also be able to have good test pipelines, right? So if we think about the build stage, like you're just going to keep coming back to your prompts, your tools, your models, your agent logic, as well as your evals and your data sets. Like those are living things that will change over time. And you're going to want to be able to tweak them for both production and test. So a couple tips here. First one, if you're getting started building, I think one of the things we've seen time and again is that people end up building like a whole end-to-end prototype, design the UI, build all the software, and then the models don't behave like you expect. You don't have the right data to get them to behave like you expect. So this would be just one like highlight that we would say, avoid that temptation to build the whole end-to-end app. One big fintech company we work with, they've got a great practice here. Their head of product for all the AI stuff that they do has said to the organization, like before engineering will even entertain building a thing, go build a GPT, with ChatGPT that actually imports your real data. Show us that like your concept is working and it's actually valuable. And almost anybody can go do that. It doesn't have to be an engineer. It can be someone on the business side or a product person with a spreadsheet. So that would be like, one key thought is like, if you can just get something working with a state-of-the-art model as a starting point, that's a good proof of concept before getting started building the rest of an app. Another thing to just help at the build stage, especially when you're first getting started, think about versioning everything. And this is not like necessarily GitHub version control, right? I think we see a lot of teams that begin with the assumption of, hey, it's all in Git. But what's really in Git is probably just your prompt configuration, and like your, Git versions are going to move independently of whatever a testing workflow looks like. The ability to like really connect what version of your prompts and model configuration and agent logic is happening to the data sets that you're testing with and the evals that you're running will be really valuable later on. And so probably a best practice here is like, think about setting up a way to version your prompts, a way to version your data sets, and a way to connect that like, hey, if we test this system with this data set, this is what came out of it. So that as you work on improving it, you really know like, where did each result come from? I think another thing about this of like, if you're getting things out of GitHub, then other domain experts on the team, people that don't live in your code base, will be able to see the prompts and think about what to fix. The last one here, figuring out what to measure at this stage. It's definitely an important thing to do as you move forward. But I think one of the things we'd encourage here, again, like thinking about what's worked well and what hasn't. Sometimes this process can end up being like very theoretical. It's not uncommon that we've seen a PM or an engineering lead sit in the room and imagine metrics together. That can make sense with business KPIs. If you're thinking about how are you going to communicate the success of a product to the business, like great, plan those out. But if you're thinking about the evals that are actually going to help you improve product quality, like those could be very independent from your business KPIs and really be more about like something like a unit test. Like you want to be able to detect what's going on and fix it. And so in this way, I think we'd say like the best way to think about what those should be is to just look at data and group the issues that are happening and start to build some metrics that you want to move that would actually correlate to quality, right? Think about like your evals there, business KPIs different. Cool. So that's like the build stage that you'll come back to time and again. Also, when you're iterating on something after you've built it, kind of the next stage in this workflow is setting up a good test process and being able to really test your whole system end to end. Think about here, like the promise is, that you can know the change or the impact of any change before you ship it. And what we're talking about doing here is basically like running offline tests and experiments. This is an interesting pattern if you've been in traditional ML world, like offline evals could be one thing, CI testing is something else the engineering team does. In this world, like we think about them coming together to the point that it's kind of the same workflow, just run at a different time, right? You basically are going to run a batch of data and all your evals through a version of your system. You could do that in a manual way. It's part of looking at the quality of the system. You could do it in CI. But here you don't want to be able to like just compare, versions of your system, versions of your prompts with your evals, so you can score them and see how you're improving. It's going to be really important as part of this to like have humans in the loop still. We don't know a single team that's doing this well, where it's just about trusting the metrics. There's always people looking at data. And to that end, like a couple suggestions here. One is that like if you're working on building a test system where you're trying to like run a big data set through any change in your system and know how it's behaving, you want to figure out how to use representative data. One of the probably common failure states that we see is that people come up with test cases internally, or they synthesize them. Maybe they riff with ChatGPT and say, give me 50 examples to test with. And it's often the case that those are biased, or they're like too normative. And then in the real world, you're going to end up with like weird edge cases, abuse vectors, errors, customers doing weird things with your system. So think about here, like, how do you come up with data sets for testing that are going to look like production? And that can often look like actually using production logs, capturing those and incorporating them later. Another one here, especially if you've been in the ML space traditionally, doing data science work, like traditional ML evals are not always the same thing as LLM system evals. There's a bunch of things that can be different, including like you can't always predict exactly what a perfect answer would be. If we're thinking about what happens in a chatbot, Eric mentioned earlier, for instance, or a lot of subjective text generation use cases with LLMs, you're not always in a world where there's just a clean, definitive golden set answer. There can be a bunch of good answers. And so I think here, like there are cases if you're doing categorization where you can do classic ML precision and recall type work. But if you're doing that pattern matching and thinking it's only going to be that, you're probably missing some opportunity to run like, some custom Python function that'll help you detect errors in your JSON format, right? That would just be, useful as an eval metric or criteria. Anytime you run a test, if that's failing, you want to fix it. Or you could be doing things that are more subjective and like very nuanced. I think about people across our customer base that are asking questions like, is this customer, discount code valid? Or asking, if some set of answers cited all of the known relevant links that you might want to cite in an answer. Like these are niche questions that you can set up as an eval that anytime you test the system, if those things are failing, you want to fix it. And they're not quite the same as just traditional precision and recall. The last thing here, the testing stage, like I think this is one of the most impactful things we've seen in terms of teams just being able to work and run faster, is setting up domain experts to actually run these kinds of batch tests themselves. I think about a couple teams we work with where they've done this, and it's been transformative for velocity, because the old world used to look like if we want to change something, try a change to a prompt, whatever else, it had to go from whoever the domain expert was, or product manager, or customer support person with a suggestion, through to maybe data science or engineering, who would set something up and test it, had to make it into a build pipeline, all kinds of things have to happen before they actually see that change. And, if you can get domain experts set up, like what a different version looks like, they're able to actually run a whole data set through the system, run all of their evals. And anytime that they like change some part of an agent, or some part of a prompt, or want to swap out a new model and see how the latest model release impacts the system, they can go do that themselves while engineering and ML are doing, harder things, higher leverage things that they're uniquely suited to do. So that's testing. Next step in this workflow is this observe step. So observability, in a lot of ways, doesn't change in terms of the basic goal. We're trying to find issues in a system, but when you're thinking about, in the generative AI world, maybe one of the first goals is just being able to know what's happening and what to fix before people complain about it. And part of how you get there, in our experience, has been figuring out how to run some of your evals online on your logs as well as offline, right? So we talked before about, with LLM evals, it can make sense in some cases to have single answer grading where you don't need a ground truth. It doesn't need to have a source data set. You can simply just score any new result that comes into the system. And that becomes a way to understand the behavior of the system without or beyond what you can get from just traditional Datadog style logging, right? Like HTTP codes, you need to know if there are errors, of course, but if they're successful and you just know that a request went through, in a lot of cases with an LLM, you have no idea if what went through was any good, right? So think about LLM, judges or custom code functions you might write being tools to automate that kind of telemetry for observability, know like what's happening in production with a goal to like spot issues, certainly incorporate customer feedback. We're not saying don't do that, and then be able to dig into that data. So we'll keep talking about the importance of getting people involved. But some tips here, like just how to think about observability, maybe differently from traditional observability. One is that like a goal here is to understand your app behavior. What's your agent actually doing? What's a chatbot actually doing? What's an LLM, workflow spitting out in terms of a summary document for financial information or something. I think I just mentioned this a little bit, but here what you're really wanting to look at is not the HTTP error codes. You're wanting to look at like, what is the prompt input and output? What tools were selected if you're building an agent? How did the agent make decisions through a given run? And if you can get to the place where you're automatically scoring and categorizing these results, you can make sense of a lot of production data that a human's never going to have time to read. Another thing here, just to reiterate this idea, think about observability here is like really looking for gaps versus your test scenario. If the ideal test scenario is 100% what's going to happen before you ship it, but the real world's always different. Think about here like a goal of spotting those gaps so that you know what to dig in on, what to go fix. I think what this ends up looking like in practice is, maybe on a weekly basis, on some regular basis. We see teams set up like a Friday afternoon session. A couple teams we talked to have done this sort of thing where it's like, we might even buy pizza and sit in a room for 90 minutes and just have everybody review a bunch of row level data that might have gotten negative customer feedback, might have gotten bad eval scores, might include just a random sample, which we'll talk about in a bit. But they code those issues, they figure out what's actually happening, what are the biggest problems we might want to go fix next sprint, and then prioritize that work, as well as, and this is important, another good opportunity, when you find that stuff and you're realizing this is different from what we tested, it's really helpful to take those production examples that are surprising, those edge cases that customers come up with, and incorporate those into your test data sets so that you're testing for them again the next time. So that workflow of actually going from production data review back to your test suite, maybe you want to tweak your evals, maybe you want to tweak your data sets, but it's a really valuable way to like build that feedback loop and improve your test situation.
That loop becomes like really important. One of the things we've seen a lot is like people will, at the outset of like taking on some project, they'll create their eval suite and they'll put a lot of thought, a lot of intention to it up front, but then they kind of just don't update it, right? And so what they then find is like their eval metrics are going up and to the right, but they're not spending a lot of time like actually reviewing data and like understanding what their customers are seeing. And what happens is like that eval suite becomes like a pretty inefficient proxy for like the actual end experience. And so it's really important, like you're saying, Ian, that when you're reviewing that data and then you're actually incorporating the things you're learning into both data set strategy, prompt strategy, but also importantly, like updating evals to reflect that things that you're learning.
Awesome. Thanks for chiming in, and keep doing it. Cut me off. I'm just running through it. I want to get to Jeremy's demo because I think he's going to show what some of this stuff looks like. Cool. So last thought here. It's a common pattern that people are just looking at issues. We're talking about like, yes, you should look at issues if you have them. One of the highest value things you can do is just study your errors. But you also want to look at random samples, and this isn't always obvious to people. If you're just looking at the errors, like you got a whole suite of unknown unknowns. One of the probably largest companies we've gone deep with on this topic, they were running a consumer chatbot. They would describe, like, early on, they hypothesized a bunch of evals that they found in development that they thought would matter. And they did a human data review process every week for the first few months of running the chatbot, to just make sure that they knew what was going on. By the time they'd gotten 3 months in, all of their evals had changed. Everything that they were actually reporting on was different. The way that they were measuring quality and describing it up to leadership was different. And it was a result of, basically discovering the real world issues were just different from what had happened in their test scenarios. Um, and they got there by having eyes on, like, just what was happening across the system generally versus just looking at a class of errors. So good reason to just look at random data on a regular basis. Last step is evals here. We put this at the center, kind of talking about the familiar workflows we're always running. And like I said, you want to always be running these through your evals and treating your evals as part of each step in that process. But what are we talking about here? If the evals are really a key to product quality with AI products, we're talking about custom evals. So that's important, I think, for a lot of folks that have been, like, paying attention to what's happening with LLMs. You hear about MMLU, you hear about different code gen benchmarks, the ARC AGI benchmark, whatever else. Those are all designed for foundation models. They're designed to describe general model behavior on public benchmarks. If you're building a niche legal tech product or financial tech product or HR tech product or whatever else, it's pretty likely that whatever happened with MMLU for that foundation model just doesn't matter in your use case, right? You want to know, is the information we're sending out to our customers relevant and accurate and, on brand and all these things in your context, right? So we're talking here about, like, product specific evals. We would treat human expert review as a type of eval. Some teams talk about it differently. They talk about data annotation and, whatever else they would call it. But, when we think about evals, like, we think about primarily, like, three classes. You're using a person to, study some data and annotate it or label it using some kind of structure in order to score it. Maybe you're using an LLM to do that, or maybe you're using code that you wrote to do that. But, put human reviews in this bucket. And then, importantly, especially for folks that are getting into the agentic AI world, starting to build more products like this, you're going to want to have a hierarchy of evals. Each component in the system is going to have a different definition of quality and evals that it needs to know if it's, like, working. If I change this prompt, this tool definition, this step in an agent flow, each of those are helpful to have an eval so that if you work on changing a prompt or you want to change the model that you're using, you can run those evals in that context to know if the component works. And then if you're building an agent, you're going to want to level up as well. And at that level, you're probably looking at, like, the end-to-end kind of, like, input and output, task level work. If I ask an agent to do this, what's the ultimate response? That's a different type of data set. It's a different type of eval. And I think what we've found is, like, anybody who's building an agent ends up wanting both. You want to be able to test your prompt change first, and then in CI or as part of a manual process, kick off a test end to end and make sure the agent's still behaving well overall. We'll get into what that looks like. But a couple more tips here. Sorry, I just saw a question, Samuel, what I mean by hierarchy. If that wasn't clear, we'll come back to most of the Q&A at the end. But the hierarchy I'm talking about is just basically like that component level eval. Imagine you've got 15 different prompts you might call on an agent, and then you've got to level up, which is like the agent level eval. So think about, like, the building blocks is the prompts in the system, the tool calls in the system, and then at the top of that, like, the agent level work. Cool. So a couple tips here. Mentioned this more than once, but just to, like, really drive the point home, having people looking at data is a goal. I don't think this is obvious all the time, especially if you're paying attention to, like, eval hype on Twitter or the blogs or whatever else about what's happening in generative AI. Everyone's thinking, oh, we just got to automate all our evals. None of the teams that we work with who are doing this well have stopped looking at lots of data, right? Evals become a signal to help them figure out what to look at, but there's no objective where they're just trying to stop looking at data. I realize this is a little bit cut off in the slide, but so think about like here's like evals as a pair to your human review team. They help you scale your understanding of the system. They help you, detect those errors and know where to look. They help you measure improvement over time. But there should never be a point where you're thinking, I just don't want my people looking at data. And that's important as a leader to plan for. I think that's also been a thing we've been seeing is that like engineering leaders, product leaders can end up getting surprised that all of a sudden, like we've shipped this thing and now I thought we were just going to be done and move on to the next thing in our roadmap. And it needs some care and feeding and babysitting and attention. It's something to plan for.
There's one question that I want to pull forward a little bit from the chat just because it's so on topic right here. But Samuel asked, I imagine the domain expert reviews are a non-trivial ask for those folks and might often be like an additional ask on top of their current workload. How do you get buy-in from the experts and how do you balance ensuring that the review is thorough and useful and not just burdensome?
You want to take it?
Yeah, I have a perspective here. It feels weird to read the question and answer it, but here I go. I think one of the biggest things, and like Ian, you were alluding to this a little bit before, is if you are only labeling data for sake of like reporting on metrics, I think it can feel like a tall task, right? And some people honestly do think of it like that. So I think what is helpful is like reshifting the frame to be like, we are labeling data and like reporting on metrics is like exhaust from that. But the real value is actually building like a depth of understanding about what's working in our system, what's not working in our system. And so importantly, I think you can frame it, and like this is critical for leadership buy-in as well, right? Like this only happens if it's, you have top-down buy-in, is framing it so like those domain experts are not just like labelers, but they're a very critical part of this like development process. And they're actually informing a lot of the nuance. Like we even see a lot of these domain experts start to like shift into doing prompt engineering and evaluation and stuff like that. So I think the answer to like get buy-in from both them, but also organizationally, is to really frame it as like, oh, these people are a core part of this development workflow. We're not just offloading purely labeling tasks to them.
Yeah. And this is also a perception thing at the leadership level to manage. Like I was talking to a head of product at a big public company last couple of weeks. He was describing kind of the confusion and some of the frustration from like a level up in leadership where they were saying, why do we still have people looking at this? Aren't you supposed to all have automated our evals, and like shouldn't the LLM judges and the, custom functions we're writing just tell us all the answers? And, it was interesting talking through it because it's like, I think there's a perception that that's supposed to be what happens and people don't want to spend the time on it. But the counterpoint is like, he was just describing like no amount of, LLM judge work that we've done gets to the nuance that our human expert team can pick up when they're really digging into the data. And, it feels like it should be a feature that we continue to have eyes on this versus like trying to just automate it all away. If we think about just all the different perception things that, we have when we're looking at content and business context, like you have to represent all of that human expertise in your eval suite. Like that might not be worth it either. Maybe it's like a better use of time to just figure out an efficient human in the loop process, make sure it's high value data to look at, make sure your evals are pointing to stuff that might be worthy of attention. Don't overwhelm them, make them look at everything in the system, but position it as an opportunity, like a real competitive advantage to make sure the system's behaving well. Cool. We'll keep going here. Two last thoughts and pass it to Jeremy. So one, just talked about LLM judges, maybe how you can't always trust them. You need to think about this. Like we get questions that are very binary. Are LLM judges trustworthy? I think the answer is it depends, right? It's very easy to write an LLM judge that isn't trustworthy. It's also very possible to write one that is. Most of our customers depend on them in some production capacity. I think the point here, just like other prompt engineering, is they take a little bit of testing and tuning. Big point of advice, like you should probably never write an LLM judge that you just ship into production and don't look at whether it's doing the right thing. Just like you do a little bit of QA with your prompts, do some of that with your LLM judges. And then the last thought here, said this a couple of times to make sure the point's really clear. Think about ways to design evals you can run both online and offline. If you're coming from a traditional ML world where you did most evals offline. Like, this is new. People aren't planning for it. But it's one of the highest value things you can do in terms of making that feedback loop go faster. So with that, I'm going to pass to Jeremy.
Cool. So try and do this in about 10 minutes or so, because we got some really good questions in the chat that I do want to get to. We're going to be doing a demo here, and like this demo will be a demo of free play, but like think of it more as trying to just like demo the manifestation of what this flow might actually look like in practice. So we're going to take this kind of flow that Ian was talking about here and show you how we can step from one phase to the next, using evals as kind of the grease that helps that whole thing turn. So given that this is a loop, right, we can kind of start anywhere. We'll start in the observe section here, and just assume that we already have some prompts, we already have some eval suite set up, but I want to go through the flow of basically like identifying a problem, moving into build mode and trying to fix that problem, and then finally moving into test mode and actually going through and like testing and deploying that change. So we'll jump into free play here. Just for some context, so like we know what we're looking at. The thing that I'm going to be demoing is what we call our free play support agent, which is basically like an agentic system that sits in our Slack and it kind of tries to answer customer questions. Broadly speaking, it can take two paths. If the customer asks a question that it feels is answerable, it will like do retrieval and try and answer that question. Or if it's something more along the lines of a feature request, it'll help like log that and interact with our linear and try and figure out, are we working on it? Are we not working on it? If we're not working on it, create an issue about it. So that's what this agentic system does. So we're in observe mode here. What I've done is I've basically created this persistent view that is trying to capture, it's using my LLM as a judge evals as sort of the first line of defense, right? And like Ian was talking about, this is super important, which is once you go into production, you might have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of things flowing through the system. And it's like, where do you direct your attention, right? And so that's where like these online evals become really important. So we've set up a series of evals that are running online on a subset of production traffic and basically flagging issues, right? And now I've created this view that like answer completeness is a 1 through 3 scale. So anytime it's a 1 or a 2, it goes in this bucket. So now me, if I'm, kind of a builder of this system, I can come in here and focus on these things that have been flagged for me to look at. So I'll just pop one of these open. And basically what we're looking at here is, Ian alluded to this before, but we basically now in these more agentic systems, we have multiple levels of the hierarchy. And it's really important that we are both testing and evaluating at multiple levels of that hierarchy. So what I mean when I say that is we think of like this agent, right, has a top level, which is like some question comes in and then there's an output to that question, right? So the like top level of evaluation is basically just looking at what went in and what came out and saying like, does what came out seem sufficient given what went in? And you just treat everything on the inside as a black box almost. But this is like the first line of defense. And so this is what, in this case, flagged this for me, which is our LLM is a judge for answer completeness, flagged this and said like, based on this user question, this was just like not a good enough answer. So now I can now dig in and I want to say, okay, great. Now I want to find out like, where did we go wrong in this flow? And this is where we step one level down in the hierarchy to like, in this case, more of the like prompt or individual agent level. So what happened first is this thing basically went to this router prompt, and the router prompt classified it as a feature request right off the bat. And I see my actual LLM's a judge here said that doesn't seem like the correct route, which I like confirm as a human. I say, yeah, this actually looks like maybe a question we could have answered. So like right at the outset, because the router classified this as a feature request, it got routed to our linear bot flow, which basically called a sequence of tools and ended up creating an issue in our backlog. But this is actually something that could have been answered for the user. So that's why it's an incomplete answer here. But the point at which we went wrong was super early in the pipeline at the router level. And so this is why those multiple levels are really important, is because if you're just measuring things at the like top agentic level, then you kind of don't know where to go focus and where to go work. Like it's really hard to only work at the top level. So you really want to be able to like make your fixes and your experimentation super targeted and then understand how those map to the broader context. So I'll show you what that flow looks like, which is, like I said, like let's say this router, this was like a bad categorization on the router front. I can open this in the editor up here and basically go right into experimentation mode. So what I'm doing now is I just moved from this observe loop. I'm starting to move into the build and experiment loop. This is why we feel like it's really, really important to have all of these flows integrated into like a common platform, is so that you can make the data actionable at every point in time. I think the biggest friction we see with teams is they have, things spread out all over their place. Like they do their logging over here. Then the only way they can work on stuff is by like pulling it into a notebook, right? And there's like all these disparate flows. You really like your product quality ends up being a direct function of like your iteration speed. So everything you can do to reduce the friction there is super critical. So I'm now like in experimentation mode with my router prompt specifically. I could like open up with a new tab here and like experiment with a fix. And I won't necessarily do it live here, but basically I can run this. Wow, that happened to work perfectly. But you see on the left, my original version of the router categorize this as a feature request, and my new version of the router categorized as a question. So me as a builder of the system, like, yeah, that actually feels right to me. So I feel like I've gotten to a better router prompt now. But I'm not just going to go ahead and be like, great, push it to production, right? Like I haven't yet done two things. I haven't measured like what the impact is at scale, but importantly, I haven't measured what the impact is in the broader context of my like multi-step agentic system. So that's what I'm going to do next, is now I'm moving from this build phase, right? Which, in reality is often not that quick, as you just saw, right? There's like probably some more experimentation in there, but just for sake of the demo, I'm now going to move into this test mode, which is like, I have a change in hand to my router prompt in this case that I feel is a good candidate, right? And I want to validate that now at scale in the context of my broader system. So what I did is I ran an end-to-end test of my agentic system. So I deployed, or I staged my new version of my router prompt here, and I went ahead and ran an end-to-end test. And now what I'm looking at on the left is the previous config of my agent, and on the right, the new config of my agent. And I can see these metrics both at the top level, right, the agent level, but also on a per prompt basis. So all my prompts that operate within here. And now this is giving me kind of like a report card, so to speak. This is a good one. I like this because it's generally reflective of changes, which is it's very rare that you make a change and everything gets better, right? Oftentimes what actually happens is you make a change, some things get better, some things might get slightly worse, and you're making a pretty multi-dimensional decision to like deploy or not deploy this thing. So like in this case, I'm seeing huge improvements on, for example, the answer faithfulness dimension, but then I'm seeing like some slight regressions on other dimensions like answer relevance. This actually kind of makes sense, right? Is like basically the new version is being much more cautious and much more faithful, but it also then is answering less questions with less specificity. So there's just some trade-off there. Now, one of the things that we see customers have a lot of success with is like Ian was alluding to in his portion. Everyone wants to get to a world where it's just automated testing, right? Like we're used to with traditional software, and there's no kind of manual processes here. But the reality is like, we're just, as an industry, not there yet, and like may never get there. So there's this dance between automated testing and the human review process. So a lot of times what we'll see people do is it's really important to be able to automate testing so you can make like quantifiable decisions at scale. So we'll see people run these tests, and they might run a test against 1,000 examples, way more than they could review every time for human consumption. But then what they might do is say, send this to a domain expert and say, hey, ran this test, I'm thinking of making this change. The top level metrics tell me it's a good idea, but can you like sample some of the individual row level data, read through it, and give me a sense of what's happening? So you can drill down here into the individual examples. And this is where we might have a domain expert, for example, in the mix, just reviewing the old version versus the new version on some specific input, right? This is a good example here where we see the router made a different decision, left versus right. So on the right, it routed it to a question and then went ahead and answered that question. Whereas on the left, it routed it to our linear agent who tried to create an issue about it. But it's really important that you have domain experts in the mix here who are reviewing at least some subset of this. We particularly see this a lot with model changes, where you'll make like GPT-5 comes out, you go ahead and run the test, all your metrics go up, but then there's some nuance you're not capturing in those metrics. And the humans who are reviewing it might go, oh, these answers, I don't know, are way more verbose and our customers aren't going to like them. So there's always kind of a nuance there where it's important to get human eyes on like some of this stuff to really understand, but also like build intuition about what's working and what's not. So that's how we like think about going through this flow end to end, right? As we're, starting observability, using live monitoring of evals to catch issues and direct our attention. From there, that tells us what to work on, because that's one thing that's really important is like, if you're sitting down, you're saying, I'm going to work on the general quality of my system. You're like not being specific enough, right? Like you should be working on a very specific problem. So that live monitoring helps you there. Then you can kind of move into that build and experiment mode, come up with candidates to test. And then from there, you're testing and ultimately making a deployment decision. And evals are the grease in the wheel the whole time, right? They're the thing that's taking you from one phase to the next. So I know it's a little bit quick. That's all I have from a demo perspective, but I see a bunch of questions coming in. So I would love to get to those. I have a lot of these written down, so I can just go ahead and start to read some out for you all. So the first question here is, how do you see the role of a product manager, especially on like smaller squad style teams, with respect to new roles you mentioned at the top of the presentation?
Good question, Will. I think honestly, it depends on the domain that they're building in. I mean, if they truly are a subject matter expert, which in most cases they are, unless they're working in a specialized domain, like the medical field, for example, they themselves should be more empowered than ever to like participate in writing new prompts, trying new models, iterating and tweaking the system to see what changes. The other thing that we've seen on small teams is the lines are often fairly blurred, not just for PM, but engine design. AI is truly an accelerant in this new world, and a lot of folks are coloring outside of their traditional lines. Jeremy is a good example here. We often joke that he's a full stack employee, even though his technical title is product lead. He's contributing to things like engineering, design, sales, webinars, right? But also like new functions, prompt engineering, crafting evals. And I think this generally works for smaller teams. But as you expand, I think you're definitely going to want to define who is, ultimately responsible, who's accountable for things like AI quality. And to Jeremy's point, specifically defining what quality means for your product is a bit of an art. So making sure someone is driving that. Also, defining the person that is responsible for spinning up and running the systems and the workflows to improve quality of the product that you're building is important, including like, hey, we've got to look at the level data on a regular basis.
Move to the next question here because we got a lot of them to get through, a lot of good ones here. We had another question. Any opinions on how internal product pod evals versus DE evals should progress in the quality pipeline? Should they use the same grading scale or criteria for quality? I can take that one. I don't know. So I think one of the things with the tensions that I see a lot here is you kind of have these different like levels of evaluation where there's like all the way down to the lowest level. It's like, is this thing producing the JSON I asked for, right? Like a schema check, all the way up through like metrics that are measuring your product quality. And I think it's really important where you want to separate your like LLM evals from your business metrics and not necessarily conflate the two. So like your LLM evaluation metrics should be all about ensuring that your system is like behaving in the way that it's supposed to behave. But you can always get into a world in which your system is behaving the way that you intended and still not driving value for customers. So like one of the mistakes I see all the time is organizations are like reporting out, like a given team will be reporting out to other folks in the organization what their accuracy is, what their F1 score is. And that's just like, in my opinion, totally the wrong level to be thinking at organizationally, right? Like you would never describe to another team your like unit test coverage as a means of like reflecting how good the software is at driving value for customers. This is the same. Like your evaluation suite should drive your day-to-day development. And then you need to have a separate set of metrics that are like kind of the business metrics to understand if this thing is having success, because one might be going up while the other one is not.
I'm going to take another one here for the sake of time, keep moving. Kevin asked a question. He said, in a typical growth stage flow, how much effort is human review? Are we talking about someone doing this full time? Maybe SMEs are assigned a couple hours a week to review problematic items. Some answer version of like, yes, I guess it depends on your organization. We see a range of answers here. Probably on the minimum side, you know, uh, a half day every 2 weeks or something. Like if someone's not taking enough time to actually look at a good sample of what's happening in production and just know what's going on, you're kind of flying blind and probably leaving opportunity on the table to improve at a minimum, right? I think it really depends though on like how your organization's set up. I think a couple of things I would say. One is like we rarely see people outsourcing this kind of human labeling. I think we all know about the scale AIs of the world, people that are making tons and tons of money doing data annotation generally for the large language model, like training purposes, like foundation model work. This kind of niche stuff, like we mostly see teams doing this internally or with like very closely managed contractors because they're trying to figure out like nuanced parts of their business that are just hard to communicate elsewhere. And if the goal is really improving the product and not just like training a model, you want to find the feedback loop to engineering, everybody else to make it better. I do think going to like the further extreme, we've seen multiple teams we work with actually dedicate a full-time person. Maybe they pulled them in from like a product specialist role, like a third tier kind of support expert, and say, hey, your job from now on is doing just like AI product quality. We want you thinking about running prompt experiments. We want you thinking about how to build better evals. We want you running point on data reviews. I also would say like it's been really valuable to have engineers and PMs doing this together and not outsource it just to domain experts, right? It's like if there's somebody else who's doing the data evaluation and it's not the people building the system, kind of the point Jeremy was just getting at, there's probably a lost opportunity there too. Even if like, you need a domain expert to look at domain specific stuff, engineers who might not be deep in the domain will still have a lot of perspective on how they could make it better. But I recognize not everybody can afford to just dedicate a person full time to it. Better to do something than nothing. That would probably be our core advice.
And I think it's important to think about what your goal is. Like we work with some big like regulated companies that like are required to label and report out a certain amount. But if you're like an earlier stage company, your main goal is just to like, the reason to look at data is to know what to work on. And unfortunately, you will have so many issues that you will know what to work on. Like Ian said, if you're looking at data, every other week for a half day, you will have plenty of things to go work on.
Cool.
We got another question here.
We're probably the last one, and then we're going to be at time. So we'll hit one more here, and then we can follow up with anybody who would like.
In your experience, how do you balance costs versus quality as you develop? Struggling to figure out at what point to say this is good enough at this cost versus I want it to be better still. I can kind of give an initial answer to this one, which is what I always recommend to people is like, as you're starting out, basically ignore costs, right? Like as you're proving out an idea, use the most powerful model, like just don't think about costs because the goal is to just like prove that you can do this. Once you've proven that you can do that, like if you can't do it with the most powerful model, ignoring costs, probably not the idea to work on. But assuming you do prove that you can do it, then kind of the next phase of development is trying to figure out what is the cost profile, like how low can I get it? Ultimately, trying to figure out the balance between cost and quality depends a lot on the value of an individual output, right? Like you might have, if the output is like each given output is like of relatively low value for the user, then you need a really low cost, right? But if the output is of really high value for the user, then you can like handle a better cost, right? Something we all know, ChatGPT, deep research, right? Each one of those requests is quite costly, but the value it outputs is really high. So like they can manage a better cost profile there.
Cool. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining. I think for the sake of time and respecting schedules, we'll move on and wrap up. If this was interesting today and it's useful to follow up, you can go sign up for free play yourself on the website. It's totally free to do that. But if you wanted to go deeper on some of these harder topics of like how to get your organization working this way, we help. At least wanted to say that. We have a forward deployed engineering team, people like Jeremy that get hands-on with our customers. So you can certainly go use the software. We can also help you on the process side. If you want to follow up, Ian at Free Play, Jeremy at Free Play, Eric at Free Play. And thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it. Have a great day.